It's a very great honor to be invited to speak at this opening symposium. It's a great pleasure to be able to visit Kyoto again. I think my favorite Japanese city from my previous visits to Japan. And I'd particularly like to congratulate you on the launch of the Urban Policy Unit for a low-carbon society, and particularly to welcome your decision to focus on transport as one of the major topics in dealing with climate change. There's a lot of evidence now in preparation for Copenhagen next month that transport has been lagging behind other sectors in its contribution to tackling climate change. And it's very important that we get to grips with that problem and provide the policy advice that's needed. What I want to do in this talk is to give you some background on what we have been doing in Europe. I hope you'll understand that I'm not as familiar with conditions in Japan, and therefore the data that I provide will be European data, but I hope that will be useful for comparing conditions here in Japan with those in Europe. I should also say you have been given a handout which is a summary of my presentation. It doesn't contain all the slides that I will be showing, but they will be on the website and available for you to look at later. Finally, I should apologize to those of you who are students that you're going to have to work as a result of my talk. I had not planned this, but I hope you will find my talk interesting nevertheless. And please don't all email me for questions afterwards. What I wanted to do in this talk was to say something about, first of all, the challenge of climate change, and then to look at that in the wider context of transport and sustainability. Because climate change is one objective, but it's not the only one, and a real challenge for policymakers is balancing those objectives. Then I want to look at the role of technology, and a lot of governments take the view that technology can solve all our climate change problems in transport. And I want to demonstrate that it can contribute, but it will not be the sole solution. And that will lead me on to talking about the range of transport policy measures, many of which we've seen in Professor Nakagawa's presentation already, and I will look with you at some of the evidence that we've been collecting on their performance. There's no one solution. That's a lesson that we've learned over several years, and so the key emphasis is on developing an effective strategy. And I want to look at some of the evidence on design of strategies. And then finally, I want to say something about the barriers to progress, because increasingly we realize that the barriers aren't technical, they're not professional, they have to do much more with politics and public acceptability and institutions and governance. And my research has been moving into those areas as we increasingly realize that. And I'll draw that together by providing some summary recommendations from work that we have been doing with the International Transport Forum. So we start with climate change, and I think we now generally understand the argument on this slide that climate change is happening. Climate change brings with it serious threats of flooding, of drought, of deforestation, and as was said earlier this afternoon, major environmental incidents which we need to plan to avoid. The IPCC, the panel on climate change, has concluded that we need to reduce our emissions by comparison with 1990 levels by at least 50% by 2050. And developed countries are increasingly accepting that they need to do more than that in order not to impose drastic reductions on developing countries. And so many developed countries are now accepting an 80% target for reductions by 2050. That's across the nation as a whole, and there's an unanswered question yet as to what the target should be for transport. Some people say it should be the same. Each sector should have the same responsibility. Others say that it is easier in the energy sector, the housing sector, industry, to reduce CO2 emissions, and transport should have a lower target. And there is not an agreed answer to that question as yet. But what we do know is that the target for transport reduction has to be substantial, and it's going to be a major challenge. Urban transport, and we're focusing here on cities, accounts for about 14% of all CO2 emissions in most developed countries. Transport as a whole is about 23 to 25%. More than half of that comes from urban transport. In a European context, emissions are expected to increase by a further 15% by 2020 from transport, which of course is clearly inconsistent with a target for a substantial reduction by 2050. And as I'll show later in my talk, that reduction, whether it's 80% or 70% or 60%, cannot be achieved by technology alone. We have to look at policy interventions as well. Now, we're focusing today on climate change, but it is important to accept that climate change is only one of the objectives that a city would have. This slide summarizes the European Parliament's definition of sustainable urban transport, produced in 2001, so now 8 years ago. And it uses the three main legs, the three main planks of sustainability: social sustainability, economic sustainability, and environmental sustainability. And you'll see that it covers questions like providing adequate access, improving safety, protecting health, improving equity, fairness between different members of society now and between society now and society in a decade's time. It focuses on economic principles of efficiency and also support for the economy and regional development. And it focuses also on environmental concerns over emissions and waste, and resource consumption, and land consumption and noise. The question of climate change only really appears in this as one part of one of those 8 bullet points. It's an element of limiting emissions and waste within the planet's ability to absorb it, but it's probably the most important part of that. But we need to bear in mind that cities have all of these objectives, and they have to pursue tackling climate change within that context. I wanted to look briefly at the background to some of those other policy objectives to understand the other challenges that cities are looking at. First of all, there's the new question of peak oil consumption. For a long time, we've realized that we have a limited resource in fossil fuels, and that at some stage we will use it to its full. It's now generally accepted that oil production will peak globally sometime in the next decade. And that will mean that oil costs will rise. It will mean that markets for oil will become much more volatile. And that in turn is likely to lead to greater political instability, particularly as between the oil producers and the oil consumers. Now, that in turn means possibly that we find alternative sources for fueling transport, possibly that we find ways of reducing our demand for fuel, probably that we do both. The second issue I wanted to look at was the question of congestion. We all know what congestion is. It's a little bit more difficult to measure it, and it's more difficult still to put a money value on it. But the best estimates of the marginal costs of congestion, the costs that could be avoided if people made more efficient journeys, suggest that in European cities, congestion is costing about $100 billion per year, which is in excess of 1% of GDP. And I've seen similar figures for Japan. In the UK, the marginal cost of congestion at the moment, 10 years ago, was $10 billion, and that was projected to double in a decade. And at least 80% of all of those congestion costs arise in urban areas. The other element of the economic agenda which is experienced very differently in different countries is the question of growth. Western cities, European cities, are growing quite slowly, typical population growth of about 2% per annum. And some are actually experiencing population decline, and indeed some European countries like Japan are experiencing national population decline. But of course many cities, particularly in Eastern Asia, are growing very fast indeed. I was speaking in Beijing in September and pulled together the figures in this little table for that talk. In 1977, there were 190 cities in China. 2 years ago, there were 670. In 1977, 18% of the Chinese population were in urban areas. 2 years ago, it was almost half. So there we have cities experiencing very rapid growth and with very different challenges for how to provide for that growth. The next issue is road safety, and road safety has been a scourge of transport policy for as long as I remember. We still reckon that in the United Kingdom, road accidents are the largest single cause of death for people up to the age of about 25. We've been very successful in reducing casualty rates, but still in European cities, around 13,000 people are killed on the roads each year, and over 200,000 are seriously injured. Importantly, it's pedestrians and cyclists who are most at risk, and if we want to encourage more walking and cycling, then we have to tackle the threat of accidents. And an interesting analysis from one of my road safety expert colleagues suggests that for each of us in our daily life, being on the roads is 8 times more dangerous than any other single thing we do. Now, if you go mountaineering or deep sea diving, then maybe it's more hazardous. But for the normal day-to-day activities, being on the roads is by far the most dangerous activity. Next, atmospheric pollution. And of course, carbon dioxide is an atmospheric pollutant, but only at a global scale. But there are a number of local pollutants, oxides of nitrogen, particulates, carbon monoxide, which bring health hazards with them. Again, this is an area where we have been very successful over the last 2 decades. And the graphs shown here for nitrogen dioxides, for carbon monoxide, and for particulates all show a peak in around the early 1990s, and something of the order of an 80 to 90% reduction since then in emission levels. So real success story, mainly through new technology. Even so, pollution from road traffic in urban areas is a very serious health hazard. And recent epidemiological research suggests that as many as 100,000 deaths are brought forward each year in European cities as a result of atmospheric pollution. Or rather, 100,000 in Europe, of which about 70% are in urban areas. And that's not to say that atmospheric pollution directly kills people, but it means that people with heart and lung diseases, for example, are more likely to die from those diseases because they're exposed to pollution. And although we've made substantial improvements, growth in urban traffic, if we allow it to happen, will gradually make matters worse. Much less is known about the other environmental problem of noise. We do know that 1/5 of the European population are exposed to daytime noise in excess of 65 decibels, principally from traffic. And we do know that that's the level above which people are likely to be much more annoyed by noise and much more likely to suffer stress as a result of noise. Much more recent epidemiological research suggests that that is the level also which increases the risk of somebody having a heart attack by around 20%. And that figure has been used to suggest that in Europe as a whole, perhaps 20,000 deaths are brought forward each year as a result of noise. Now, this comes as a surprise to many people because whereas people have understood that atmospheric pollution was dangerous, people rarely think of noise as being dangerous. We're beginning to realize that it is a serious health hazard. Finally, 2 rather different issues. The first has to do with the question of exclusion. exclusion from activities, either because one has a low income, or one is elderly, or one lives in an inaccessible area, or because one has a disability. Now, it's much more difficult to get Europe-wide figures on this, but a major United Kingdom study 5 years ago, first of all noted that even with high growth in car ownership, 30% of UK households still do not own a car, particularly in lower income groups. And more importantly, that those without a car are increasingly finding access difficult as we redesign our cities to provide for the car. And again, Professor Nakagawa stressed this in his introduction. The UK figures suggest that 30% of households without a car find it difficult to get to hospital. 15% find it difficult even to get to supermarkets where the lowest cost food is available. 40% of those without a car who are seeking a job say that traveling to work, traveling to find jobs is difficult. And then looking at it a different way, 1 in 5 of our population, and I suspect the figure will be similar in Japan, have some form of long-term disability that makes it harder for them to use conventional transport. And that's a figure which is going to grow as our populations get older, and so we have to make sure we provide for them. My final slide deals with the policy objective that's emerged most recently, and my apologies for this rather unacceptable photograph, but it illustrates a problem which we are experiencing increasingly in the West. Japan, with its healthier lifestyle and its healthier diet, perhaps does not suffer in the same way. But what we're realizing is that much of what transport contributes affects health. Pollution affects health, noise affects health, of course accidents affect health. Social exclusion can affect health because it limits our abilities to do things to gain access to facilities that promote health. But equally, as transport becomes a more sedentary occupation, as people use cars more, as children are driven to school more, the lack of exercise in travel is itself contributing to a decline in health. It's estimated that 1 in 4 of adults in some Western countries are obese, and some projections, although they've been questioned very recently, suggest that perhaps over half the population by 2050 will be obese. Now, I set those up to make the point, again, that urban transport planners, city governments, have to try to tackle all of these objectives in what they're doing. Climate change will be important for them, but climate change will be no more important, probably, than many of these other ones. And so we need to design a strategy that can help to tackle all of these objectives. Let me then go back to the question of climate change and look particularly at what the UK government has been doing over the last 2 or 3 years in its policy on climate change. We introduced, and I think we were the first developed country to do this, a Climate Change Act last year, which put into law our commitment to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, but also required consecutive governments to produce 5-year carbon reduction plans. And it also established a climate change committee which develops those plans. And that climate change committee late last year produced its recommendations for the first 3 of those 5-year carbon budgets, the 15-year period from 2008 to 2022. And it actually specified targets in terms of emissions by 2020 by comparison with 1990. And it set 2 budgets, an interim budget of a 34% reduction, which the UK would achieve whether other countries committed themselves or not, and a 42% reduction provided that other countries commit themselves to doing something similar. And this was our starting point for the negotiations in Copenhagen next month. And it's difficult to know what to believe from the newspapers. Last week everybody was saying there was going to be no agreement, but the Japan Times told me yesterday that there was going to be an agreement, so let's hope there will be. And if there is an agreement, then our target goes up. That 34% figure, if you like, compares with the 25% figure that Japan has specified for the same period, which Professor Taniguchi mentioned, and a 20% figure Europe-wide. So we in the United Kingdom are ahead of the field, but I'm not saying that as something to be proud of, but something to illustrate the commitment which governments have to make. Even so, that said very little on transport. It didn't say, and there has to be a 34% reduction for emissions from transport, but it did look at the ways in which transport might contribute. It predicted that the major source would be from technology improvements, growth in the use of electric vehicles, and pursuit of the European Union's policy on improved efficiency standards for new vehicles, which aim to have vehicles emitting no more than 95 grams per kilometre, that's cars, by 2020. That it predicted would produce 12 million tonnes of carbon equivalent reduction by 2020. Behavioural change, it predicted, could produce a bit less than that, around 10 million tonnes. And it identified 3 main elements. What it called eco-driving, which is encouraging people to drive more efficiently, less acceleration and deceleration and lower speeds, and particularly better enforcement of the speed limit on our motorway network, which is currently 70 miles an hour or about 120 kilometers an hour. And then what is called rather vaguely smarter choices, which is the idea that people themselves can choose more efficient ways of traveling. They can combine journeys, they can travel less, they can use public transport rather than the car, they can walk and cycle. But that policy said nothing specifically about modal change and the extent to which you needed to encourage people out of cars and onto other modes. Neither and this is, I think, very important for your own unit, it said nothing about land use policy. And yet, as we will see, land use policy is a major determinant of how people travel. Let's just look at the role of technology, and I think there are actually two important contributions of new technologies. The first is the one we've talked about, new technology to reduce carbon dependency. And one can do this by making vehicles more fuel efficient, by encouraging the development of alternative fuels, by promoting electric and hybrid vehicles, and of course Japan has been particularly successful in the introduction and marketing of hybrid vehicles, and in due course the development of fuel cell vehicles, all of which should be less carbon intensive, provided that the fuel sources for providing the electricity or the fuel alternatives are themselves carbon efficient. The other role of new technology is alternatives to the car and alternatives to the bus. These have been talked about for as long as I remember, but they are now beginning to appear. And the picture at the bottom of the slide is of a prototype vehicle which is being introduced at Heathrow Airport at the moment as an alternative to shuttle buses. It's an automated personal rapid transit vehicle to take people from the place they park in the car park to the part of the terminal they need to get to, with the idea that that would expand throughout Heathrow Airport in time and indeed be used as an alternative form of transport in particularly suburban areas of cities. Cybercars, which are electronically guided private vehicles, could provide the same sort of service, and there's interest also in the development of driverless buses to enable us to expand the coverage of conventional bus services. This slightly complicated diagram is a UK government attempt to look at the timescale and the sequence in which different vehicle technologies might come into operation over the period 2000 to the left to 2050 on the right. And you'll see that what is happening throughout that period is gradual reductions in vehicle weight and aerodynamic drag, improvements in transmission and engine design, and then hybrids playing a major role in the early stages, moving from mixed hybrids to full hybrid vehicles to plug-in hybrids which can be recharged at base, leading in due course to the development of electric vehicle technology on a widespread network, which itself will require an infrastructure for charging, and later in the time horizon, the emergence of fuel cell vehicles. So we can see the way in which those technologies might increasingly come online over the 40-year period and increasingly contribute to CO2 reduction. We did some work 3 or 4 years ago now in Leeds, looking at the question of how much CO2 reduction we could achieve in the United Kingdom in transport as a whole as a result of different approaches. We did not know then what the appropriate target was for 2050 for transport, and you can see across the bottom of this graph a series of targets. The lowest at 5 million tonnes is the 80% reduction target, and that we now think is what we need to aim for. What this graph starts by doing is saying the three red curves are business as usual, with only very slow introduction of new technologies. And the three different lines depend on the rate of economic growth. So the lowest one is low economic growth over that 40-year period. And obviously we would prefer to have higher economic growth. The upper one is what happens with the highest expected economic growth. Then the three blue curves say, well, we've got those technologies from the previous slide. Let's say that they could be introduced as fast as industry encourages them, but with no further government incentives. And then the green ones take that further and say we need government inducement and financial encouragement to encourage people to take up these technologies. And you can see that the lowest of those green curves gets us just below our least demanding target. None of them gets us anywhere close to the 80% one. But if you take that same green set of curves with a high level of technology uptake and you combine them with significant behavioral change, it is possible to achieve something of the order of an 80% reduction. And the key message, therefore, is that it's not a choice between technology and behavioral change. We have to pursue both. And therefore, we as transport planners need to think how we are going to deliver the behavioral change that reinforces the contribution of the technologists. And that is a very important challenge. And of course, it's one that has got to be pursued while still delivering improvements in congestion, in safety, in atmospheric pollution, and in health. And that's really where my own professional interests come in. I have worked in urban transport policy throughout my career, and over the last decade or so, I've been working with colleagues in Europe, helping cities to develop logical approaches to urban transport policy formulation. And this slide, and the diagram on the right-hand side, which I will take you through in a moment, comes from a decision maker's guidebook, which we produced in 2005, drawing on our experience of research in European countries and working with European cities to understand what they needed to know. And those of you students who are having to write up your reports might like to look at this. I've shown the website, our Consult website, which I will talk a bit more about in a moment on this slide, and you'll find the Decision Maker's Guidebook at the first part of this. I should say one of my colleagues at Kagawa University is busy translating this into Japanese at the moment, so I hope before too long that a Japanese version of this document will be available. And if your new unit is able to provide some case studies to contribute to it, that would be very welcome indeed. What we tried to do in this Decision Maker's Guidebook is to stimulate a logical approach to thinking about the problem. And so what this diagram does is to start off with objectives. The very top box is the objectives of transport policy and the indicators of performance. And the objectives are the sorts of things I've talked about already. It then says, what are the problems? And I've looked at some of the evidence on problems. And only at that stage does it say what types of solution, what we call policy instruments, what types of solution might we pursue. And it looks at ways of combining those into packages, into strategies, while taking account of the barriers to implementation. And I'll look a bit more at some of those principles. And then it moves on to the analytical elements of predicting what might happen, appraisal, implementation, and evaluation after the event. But it's those top few boxes that are often overlooked. It's very common to find professionals or politicians who do not say clearly what their objectives are and who jump in and assume that there's a particular solution that they ought to pursue. And unless you step back and say, what do we actually need to do? What do we need to overcome? And what is the range of solutions available to us? The strategy is likely to be less effective. As we saw in Professor Nakagawa's presentation, one of the real strengths of urban transport policy is that there's been a period of significant innovation. Over the last 20 years, many new policy instruments have become available. Car sharing, car clubs, bicycle sharing, and we both have pictures of this, has become very popular now in European cities. Concept which I had to explain to our interpreters, walking buses, which are used to encourage children to walk together to school in an organized way, in safety, rather than being driven individually. Information developments, trip planning systems that allow you, when you're still at home, to find the best way of traveling, and to update your information as you're traveling. Japan has always been very much in the vanguard in developing these. Awareness campaigns, personalized travel advice, which started really in Germany and Australia, and the illustration there is from an early scheme in Perth in Western Australia. And similar techniques with companies, encouraging companies to set up travel plans for their activities and their employees. And then, of course, pricing, whether it's road user charging, as in Singapore, or extending parking charging to private parking. All of these are quite new, and we need, as professionals, to understand how they work and where they may be used most effectively. And so another thing we've been doing in our research in Leeds is to develop a knowledge base. It's called Consult, which is the knowledge base on sustainable urban land use and transport. The website's shown there again. And what it's designed to do is to provide consistent information on each of a range of transport policy instruments. We've identified over 60 different things that you could do, and at the moment we have evidence on almost 50 of them. And we do it in a consistent way, using an 11-point scale from 5 ticks for very effective to 5 crosses for very disastrous. And we do it based both on first principles, so stepping back and saying, well, what is it trying to do and how might it work? And also looking at case studies, international case studies of good practice. And the logical structure is shown here. For each instrument, we say, first of all, how might it affect demand for travel? How might it affect the supply of travel? And how might it affect the cost of travel? And it's those 3 elements that determine whether it will contribute to a particular objective. So it might contribute to an objective of reducing congestion if you can reduce the demand for travel in congested times, or if you can increase the supply of transport in congested times. It also tells us which performance indicators it will contribute to, and which problems it will help overcome. Then we use our case studies to check that first principles analysis and confirm or modify it. And then we use that assessment to say how well will this policy instrument contribute to a particular type of strategy, a strategy to reduce car use, for example, or a strategy to reduce the need to travel. How well will it help overcome the barriers? We'll say something more about barriers shortly. Who might gain from it and who might lose, and where might the political barriers come from? And then which contexts might it work best with, and which other policy instruments might work well with it? So that's the consistent analysis, and if you look in the Consult website and you look up, for example, bus rapid transit or road user charging, you'll find that sort of analysis and some case study evidence. And I'll come back later in my talk to show you how we're using that now as a design tool. These are the 6 categories of policy instrument that we've used for Consult. There are very different ways in which you can list them. We've found this helpful. And the first is land use. And land use, of course, is not a transport policy instrument, but it's critical to how well transport works. Then we've got provision of infrastructure, management of that infrastructure, management of the road network, management of services, provision of information, greater awareness, and pricing. Now, it's very difficult to summarize a whole website and large numbers of reports in a few slides, but what I will do in the next few slides is just to give you some headline messages for each of those policy instruments. So for land use planning, and I think we move away from the handout here, my apologies, but you'll find these on the website. Higher density development, mixed development, and particularly development linked to public transport can help to reduce journey length and also to encourage less car use. One commonly found figure is that if you double the density of development, you can reduce journey length by about 30%. And similarly, if you double density, you can reduce car use because it's much easier to walk and cycle and use public transport. But those changes only happen if the transport strategy supports the alternatives. If you don't have a consistent transport strategy, then people are likely to travel as far to different locations and continue to use their cars. And the other element in land use planning, which is of considerable importance, is limiting parking provision in new developments and making sure that the parking provision that is there is open to public sector control. 2 elements of evidence on new infrastructure. First of all, new roads were, perhaps until 10 years ago, a common element in urban transport policy. They're much less commonly considered now. New roads can, in certain cases, reduce congestion, and they can remove traffic from sensitive areas and areas with an accident problem. But increasingly, the evidence suggests that they will attract additional traffic. And it's not uncommon to find that 80% of the traffic on a new road is new traffic. Journeys that were not being made before the road was built. And of course, that does not itself contribute to sustainability. It may be important in cities with high rates of growth, where you're going to get that growth in demand anyhow. But in developed cities, new road provision has only a very limited role. New light rail and increasingly of interest, bus rapid transit can be effective and can be effective in attracting drivers from cars. And typically, surveys of new services have found that 20% of their users have come from the car. So if you can introduce light rail or bus rapid transit on a heavy demand corridor, you might expect to reduce car use by 20%. But of course, the impacts are limited to that corridor, and unless you can do the same on all the radial approaches to the city centre, it's more difficult for this to be effective. And of course, infrastructure projects are expensive, light rail particularly. Management and services. Traffic management can be used to increase road capacity, and even in the best managed cities, it's probable that we can get another 10% increase in road capacity. Now, an increase in road capacity through traffic management will also attract additional users. So the key is to use it to reallocate road space and to improve provision for public transport, for delivery vehicles, for walking and cycling, for open space. And those can be done, but there's relatively little evidence that they affect car use. The other thing we can do in management terms is to improve public transport services, and particularly bus services. And there's a lot of evidence that improving service patterns for buses, improving bus reliability, and improving frequencies can attract people out of cars, and typically about 10% of the users of an improved bus service, the new users of an improved bus service, will have come from the car. Information and awareness. Awareness campaigns are, I think, one of the most exciting areas of new development. The idea being that you help the individual understand the impact of the journeys they're making and become aware of the alternatives and encourage them to use those alternatives, whether it's traveling less or traveling somewhere different or using public transport or walking or cycling. And a lot of studies now have indicated that among the target population, these campaigns can reduce car use by about 15%. The question is, can that be sustained? Or do you need to continue reinforcing that awareness campaign in order to retain that 15% reduction? And we don't know as yet. Telecommunications have for a long time been thought of as an alternative to travel. And there is some evidence that if they are used intensively, they can encourage as much as a 10% reduction in commuting to work, whether it's commuting by car or by public transport. But again, that's still somewhat uncertain. And of course, better information can improve the efficiency with which people use transport, whether it's road use or public transport. Finally, pricing, and we mustn't overlook here pricing of public transport. Fares policy is obviously important in supporting the finance of public transport, but it's also an important policy instrument. And lower fares and simpler fare structures, the use of smart cards, for example, can increase patronage and attract transfer from car use. And again, perhaps 10% of those new users will have come from the car. But if all we do is reduce fares, then we have to find another way of providing finance for public transport, and that's a barrier to progress. The other element of pricing is the role of congestion charging, and to a lesser extent, parking charges. And congestion charging now, there's evidence from Singapore, there's evidence from London, there's evidence from Stockholm and Rome and Milan. And they're all showing very similar results, that traffic reductions of 10 to 20% can be achieved and sustained by introducing pricing and by encouraging those who are marginal car users to switch to other modes or other routes or other times of day. And it's also uniquely a significant source of finance for a transport policy. And we reckon that typically a city of 1 million people might be able to generate something of the order of $100 million US per annum net for investment in other parts of their transport strategy. So there's some evidence on the possible contribution of different policies. And what I've tried to do in this slide, which begins to pull the strands together, is to take the different objectives I had down on the left-hand side and the different approaches, and I've included technology here, and just say which of those approaches can have a significant contribution to each of the objectives. And the important message from this table is that different objectives need different solutions. So if you're principally concerned with climate change, then technology and pricing are probably the most important. If you're principally concerned, as Chinese cities might be, with growth, then land use planning and infrastructure provision and management are probably more important. If you're concerned with safety and health or exclusion, then again management will be a key element. And the simple message from this, well, I suppose there are two simple messages. First of all, we don't necessarily solve all of our objectives in the same way. But secondly, if we can package these policy instruments together, we're likely to be more effective. And that leads on to a third strand of our research on urban transport policy, both in Leeds and with some of my European colleagues. And that takes as a starting point the argument that no one policy instrument alone will be sufficient, that an effective strategy needs to use the full range of policy instruments to encourage each to reinforce the others and to use one policy instrument to overcome the barriers to another. And two separate studies, both in the middle of this decade, have come up in parallel with very similar conclusions. One was a study called Propolis, which was led by some colleagues in Finland. We were not involved in this directly, but I was involved in reviewing the report. And what they did was take 7 cities, each with its own transport model, and test similar strategies. And they concluded that in all 7 cities, public transport improvements, improving speeds and service levels and reliability and fares, were very important. But if that's all you did, you would encourage longer distance travel by public transport. Secondly, pricing of car use was very important. But if that's all you did, you would encourage people to relocate away from the priced areas, particularly business, to relocate to the suburbs. Alternative land use strategies on their own had only a limited impact. But if they were combined with public transport and pricing, then they would make the public transport and pricing measures more effective, and the public transport and pricing measures would in turn make the land use policy more effective. They also tested a number of infrastructure schemes which the cities were thinking about, and the general findings on those were rather negative, that most of them were too expensive to be particularly effective. And they were typically not designed to be consistent with the overall strategy. So turning that the other way around, they concluded that infrastructure could contribute, but only if the infrastructure is designed to be consistent with a land use and pricing and public transport improvement policy, and only if the schemes were designed to be cost effective. Our own work did something rather similar. We took 6 UK cities and we used the same model, same computer model for each of them, so that we were really comparing city with city rather than model with model. And what we tried to do was to identify the optimum combinations to meet that set of policy objectives we saw earlier. And we found that in a UK context, what was needed was reductions in public transport fares, substantial increases in public transport frequency and service levels, cordon charges, a form of congestion charging in the city centre, and low-cost increases in road capacity, particularly if reallocated to improve public transport. And those optimal strategies would typically cost more than the strategy the city had at the moment, but you could also design an optimal strategy which was financially neutral, which only spent the money that the city had. And when we put that financial constraint on, we reduced the benefits by about 15%, but we were still getting 85% more benefit than the city itself was getting. And typically, if you look at those in terms of the benefit per capita, they were generating between 6,000 and 10,000 US dollars per capita of benefit over the period of the strategy. So, we're beginning to see evidence on how we can develop effective strategies. And there was a very important study conducted by the European Conference of Ministers of Transport in 2002. And although this says European, this was a worldwide study and several Japanese cities were involved. 168 cities altogether. And the general message from those cities was that they knew that an integrated approach was needed. And they knew that they should be pursuing public transport improvements, charging for road use, better management of the road network, and land use plans that were compatible with that. But they were all saying in different ways, implementing integrated strategies is much more easily said than done. And the key question was, what are the barriers to cities actually implementing those strategies? And the same report and work that that group has done since has come up with this list of key barriers. The first are institutional ones, that the governance of urban transport and land use is not effective, that there are different bodies responsible, or more than one body is responsible for the same thing. There's lack of clarity. Secondly, that cities don't follow that logical process. They don't clearly identify their objectives and specify their problems. They don't think about the full range of policy solutions. They don't adopt appropriate appraisal and implementation strategies. Third has to do with acceptability. Obviously, acceptability among the public and business, but also among politicians. And if the politicians from different parties argue with one another, then you're not going to get progress. Fourthly, barriers to do with information, understanding of how things work, but also the skills, and I'm delighted to see your new units focus on skill development, because it seems to me that's absolutely crucial. The skills to understand these complex issues. Fifth barrier, finance, either lack of money or money being made available for the wrong sorts of projects. And it's very common to find governments that provide funding for infrastructure, but not for management. And then lack of adequate legislation and regulations. And bringing those together, some work that we have done in the UK over the last 5 years, we started by asking cities in the UK which were the most difficult policy instruments to introduce. And in the UK context, they said managing buses, which are private sector responsibility, restraining traffic, demand management, congestion charging, and so on, influencing fares, and managing land use. So the 4 policy instruments that are most important for an effective strategy are the 4 that cities find most difficult. And that's why we've moved in our research to looking at those barriers and ways of overcoming them. The study we've recently completed is called Distillate, Design and Implementation Support Tools for Integrated Local Land Use, Transport and the Environment. The emphasis being on decision support. And what we were trying to do was to support cities in achieving a step change in the way in which they develop their strategies. And to do that by helping overcome the barriers. And we started by asking cities what the principal barriers were and where research would help. And our research focused on these 6 areas, helping them develop more effective performance indicators, measuring the right things and measuring them consistently over time, helping them generate appropriate solutions at the level of an individual scheme and the level of a strategy. And that one I will look at in just a moment. Helping reduce financial barriers by being aware of sources of finance and knowing how to use them effectively. Improving their ability to predict what would happen by having simpler predictive models which were more readily understandable. Helping them improve their appraisal methods, and also supporting them in more effective collaboration between the public and the private sector and professionals and politicians and the public. Just a few slides on that objective of improving option generation, of helping cities focus in on solutions that might be appropriate for them. And the starting point of this was a realization that cities generally were not very innovative and tended to place too much emphasis on supply-side solutions rather than looking at the demand side. And so we said, well, we know a lot about different policy instruments and how they work from our consult database. Can we help further with this? And so the first level of the consult option generation tool, and you can look at this on the consult website, helps the city or helps a user identify a short list of policy options that they might consider. And they start by telling the program who they are, what they're responsible for, whether they're looking at a city centre or an outer suburb or a corridor, what their objectives are and which are the most important, and what their strategy is, whether they're trying particularly to reduce car use or improve public transport or improve freight. And then it uses those 11-point scores that I showed you earlier to generate a ranked list, which can be all the 50 policy instruments in consult in a ranked order as being most relevant for them, or the top 10, or those that score better than a particular level. And they can then home in from that to click on anyone in that list and find out more about that policy instrument. And the second stage of this, which we completed within the last few months, and we're still testing with end users, allows the user to start packaging policy instruments. And you can do this in two ways. You can take one possible policy instrument, let's say bus rapid transit, and you think, I would like to pursue that. Now, what might help me make bus rapid transit more effective? What might I combine it with? And then it will list those that in your context support bus rapid transit best. Or you can take a short list of measures up to 10, and you can identify the pairs or the sets of 3 or the sets of 4 or the sets of 5 which together work best in your context. And in either case, we can do this either looking at synergy, that is achieving more from the combination of policy instruments than any individual ones on their own, or we can do it in terms of overcoming barriers. And a very good example of the use of a package to overcome barriers is what happened in London with congestion charging. Congestion charging was very unpopular, but very effective in reducing car use, and also very effective in generating income. Bus service improvements provided an alternative to the car, but they were expensive. Combining the two together, you have a pair of policy instruments where the one pays for the other. The bus service improvements provide an alternative for car users, and the package together makes the policy much more publicly acceptable. And Ken Livingstone would not have been able to introduce congestion charging in London had he not been able to use the money to pay for bus service improvements. That's the sort of principle that's in here. So what we've done is to produce a total of 18 products from this research, which are designed to help cities in the UK, but also more widely in Europe, and maybe also in Japan as well. And if you have a chance to look at these, I'd be interested in your assessment of them. Some of them are decision support tools, like that option generator. Some of them are guidebooks, and I've listed a few of those on there. And there's also a web-based tool to encourage their use. And this web-based tool asks the user to go through that logical sequence. What are your objectives? What are your problems? What are the possible instruments? How do you assess them? What are the barriers? And at each stage, if the user says, I need to know more about this, it homes them in on the decision support tools that might help best. And we've now got that hosted on the UK national website, the Local Transport Planning Network, which is available to UK local authorities to use. Now, I have an apology, it's not available to Japanese transport policy users to use because it's paid for by the UK government. And I keep trying to encourage them to open it up because I think this is an important tool more widely. But if you're interested in finding out more about any of those, let me know and I can provide you with detail. So, I've looked at some of the areas of research we've been involved with, and the tools which we as researchers have helped develop to understand the performance of policy instruments, to understand the development of strategies, and to help overcome the barriers. I wanted in these last few slides to look at some of the recommendations which are coming out from political bodies, particularly the European Conference of Ministers of Transport and now the International Transport Forum, but also from work in the United States and elsewhere in Europe. And I've drawn together a number of recommendations for national and local government under each of the barriers. So in terms of institutional barriers, recommendations for national government are that there should be a national policy framework for transport and land use, that the National Transport Department and the National Land Use Department need to work together. That there needs to be coordination also with finance and environment ministries. That responsibility needs to be devolved to local and regional government, but with it, finance, and with it, the skills. That at a local level, the city of Kyoto, for example, the transport and land use planning ought to focus on a travel to work area rather than being limited to historical administrative boundaries, even if that means working between administrations. That land use and transport need to be coordinated, and transport needs to be coordinated between all the modes, and that the private sector should be encouraged to be involved, but on the understanding that the private sector is aiming to achieve public policy goals rather than just private commercial goals. In terms of process, that cities need to plan consistency over the long term. There are some very good examples. Singapore would be one, Copenhagen would be another, where a consistent strategy over 30 years is really achieving benefits. Cities need to state their objectives clearly and need to know which objectives are more important. And they need to understand climate change as an objective in the context of what they're doing more widely. Cities need to think about problems, take their objectives and say, well, what are the underlying problems and what should we be doing about them? And then to think in terms of the full range of possible solutions and generating sensible options and sensible strategies. They need to have an appraisal mechanism and monitoring and evaluation that relates to their full set of policy objectives and performance indicators that support that. And they need to maintain an awareness of good practice both in policies and in policy implementation. In terms of acceptability, I should have said earlier, these cartoons come from our Decision Makers Guidebook. And I like this cartoon because this is a political champion leading everybody else over the hill. There's a lot of evidence that the most effective cities are the cities that have the most effective political champion. Somebody who knows what they want to achieve and can bring their fellow politicians and their professionals with them and have strong professional support. Politicians need to, and professionals need to make sure that the public understands the problems. This is a particular issue with climate change, which is a long-term problem, and members of the public may find it difficult to understand. And they need to see that the proposed solutions are the most effective solutions to those problems. And that's a particular area with solutions that require the public to do something differently. Consultation and participation are crucial right throughout the development process, from defining objectives to implementation. And throughout also the media is critical, certainly in a European context, and maybe less so in Japan, I don't know. But getting the media on side and sending positive messages rather than always criticizing is key. Better availability of transport data, both from the public and private sector. We have a problem with private sector operators refusing to provide data on usage because it's commercial in confidence. Clearly that doesn't help. Regular monitoring of performance and benchmarking with other cities. There are a number of examples now of awards at a European level, for example, which stimulate cities to do more. Better understanding of the cost effectiveness of different solutions, and that can be helped by improved modeling and improved appraisal. And of course, the development of improved skills. In terms of finance, governments making sure that long-term funding is available and that it's provided in a sustainable way, and it's focused on the strategy rather than on specific solutions. So moving away from financing infrastructure to financing the strategy as a whole. Using taxation and charging for public transport use, but also charging for road use as a key policy instrument, as an influence on use as well as a source of revenue. Imposing charges as close to the point of use as possible, and using those charges to reflect the impacts on the environment and congestion. And using the revenues from charging to improve the transport system, but also to improve acceptability of the strategy. So a couple of final slides in conclusion, just drawing these strands together. We know a lot about how to make cities and their transport strategies more sustainable. I think it's important to say that sustainability is a direction of travel rather than a specific goal in its own right. This is a bit different from a specific CO2 target. We can define a CO2 target and move towards it. It's much harder to have a target that says we've now achieved as much sustainability as we need. But we do know how to make cities more sustainable, and we know that it involves a greater focus on public transport, on charging for car use, and on managing land use. It will probably mean that much more of the transport provision is paid for by the user, particularly the car user, and also greater use of what I've called, using, I'm afraid, a bit of UK jargon, soft measures. These are the things like awareness and information and encouragement of walking and cycling. The main barriers to progress in developed cities are typically the outer suburbs, where it's harder to provide public transport and where if we don't manage land use development quickly, we will be storing up problems for ourselves. But the main barriers aren't really to do with the policy, but with the context in which policy is formed. And overcoming those requires better coordination between the tiers of government and between the agencies involved and between the public and private sector, long-term planning, problem-based analysis to develop solutions and strategies, encouraging the use of political champions, getting more involvement of the public and positive involvement of the media, and more effective use of transport data and the models and appraisal methods that build on them. Finance to support the strategy in a way that doesn't bias the outcome of the strategy, and then a legislative framework and a regulatory framework to support all of those. And as I said at the outset, these take me, and I think they take all of us, a long way from where I started as a transport engineer and a transport planner. But they are fundamental to understanding sustainability in urban transport. They are fundamental to delivering a low-carbon society. And I'm absolutely delighted to see that your new unit is intending to pursue these alongside some of the more conventional areas of research and teaching. I hope that's helpful as a background to what's been happening in Europe. I think we do have a bit of time for questions, so if I put my earpiece on to understand